Hey guys, we are reading Jeanette's story. I was a senior in high school in a small town in Washington state. I'd had a boyfriend since the previous summer. He was the captain of the football team and very athletic. And I was one of the cute girls. I was Roman Catholic and absolutely believed that I would burn in hell if I didn't lead a good life. However, we started having sex in the fall. The first time was after a football game where he had done very, very well. And after that, it continued. I really cared for him. I liked his family, and my family liked him. I told him I had missed my period, and we went to the doctor, who I assume other football players took their girlfriends too. He gave me this little white pill and said I should have my period soon. Well, I didn't. My boyfriend and I talked about it. He had a really good football scholarship to Washington State University, and of course, he couldn't be married. This was 1952. I started wearing a girdle because I had to keep my stomach in. I was so sick that spring. I had a sister who lived in San Francisco, and I wrote her a letter and said I was in trouble. She knew exactly what I was talking about. The day after I graduated from high school, I went to live with her. I never told my mother. I never told my father. I never told anyone. Both of my parents died without knowing. The previous year, in my little town of 5,000, there was a girl who had a baby and wasn't married. She kept that baby, and it was a scandal. Their house was about 5 blocks from the high school. One morning, we were sitting in class, and we heard this terrible explosion. Their house had blown up. The baby was fine, but she was terribly burned on her legs and her arms. We all thought it was God's way of disapproving. I don't know if he disapproved of her getting pregnant or of her keeping the baby, but I thought about that incident constantly when I was pregnant. Single people got pregnant, but almost everyone married. There's a saying the Irish have, something about 6-month babies. I forget, but it was very common. We couldn't even say the word pregnant. My mother became pregnant when I was 9 or 10 years old. No one told me until she brought the baby home. The first time I heard the word pregnant out loud was when I was in nursing school. While I was at my sister's, I had one maternity dress, and I remember it to this day. It was a yellow checked smock with a matching yellow shirt. I wore it every day. We didn't wear pants much in those days. I would write to my parents and say I was looking for a job. My boyfriend would write, and he would send me a dollar bill once in a while. It was the only money I ever had. The apartment house had these little mailboxes. I didn't have a key, but I could peer in there to see if there was a letter from him. If there was, I would sit by that mailbox until my sister came home. Toward the end, he wasn't writing at all. I thought it was strange because the plan was that we were going to get together afterward. The entire time I was pregnant, I actually separated myself from this baby. I had been told repeatedly, don't see the baby and it won't hurt. If you ever told him, it will be very painful for you. But they brought him to my room. The nurse was standing in the doorway holding this baby, and I screamed at her, "Get that baby out of here." That's hard memory, and I rejected him. They never brought him back again. Okay, so pausing there is definitely this theory about blank slate when it comes to both birth parents and adoptees. But the thought is, if you don't bond with the baby doesn't feel like it's yours, right? And that you'll forget it. We've heard this over and over again. On the other hand, with the adoptees, if the baby doesn't have a chance to, be with you, that skin to skin, which is extremely important, right? That the baby can immediately reattach to a stranger. Well, we know now that's not true, but even back in the 1950s and 60s, there were studies done, which we're going to be reading in the psychology of adoption, that we know was not true. I mean, it was known. It just wasn't widely known. But still, it's hard. On top of that, there's postpartum depression, and yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot. Anyway, we're gonna come back around to that. I was isolated from other mothers at the hospital. Let me tell you how naive I was. I had been in labor for so long that they kept doing rectals to see how dilated I was. And I was so sore that afterward I asked my sister, "Where does the baby come out, anyhow?" I thought it must have come out through the rectum. Oh my God. I'd taken my high school annual with me. There was one very nice nurse's aide. She was the kindest person I'll ever meet in my life because she never looked down on me for being pregnant. She would sit with me and I'd go through the annual and she'd show her my boyfriend. And I'd show her my boyfriend and be at the ball games cheerleading. Immediately after I had the baby, I was angry. I got angry at everything. I was angry at my sister, and we got into a terrible fight. I just wanted to go home, and she kept telling me, "If you go home, they're going to know. Your stomach's all out of shape." My mother obviously suspected when I went home. She had new clothes for me that were 2 sizes larger. My mother would have loved that little boy, but my mother was a blind faith Catholic, and sex was something that was never talked about. Never. It was like everything that was the Immaculate Conception. Last year, my sister said she heard a rumor that Mom was pregnant when she got married. It kept gnawing at me. I sent for a copy of her wedding license. Not only was she pregnant, she was 7 months pregnant. She could have told me that. We would have loved her just as much. I went home. I needed a job. I had been a fairly talented writer in school, and I had won some contests. As a matter of fact, I won the state I Speak for Democracy contest. I got $25, which was huge in 1952. The whole basis of my essay was something like, "Communism is like a cancer. It has its little claws and tentacles that reach out everywhere." My mother loved that. She said it was the line about the cancer that made you win. We absolutely thought if we didn't kill the Russians first, they would drop a bomb on us. And we were terrified of that bomb. People who worked on the farms were getting jobs with General Electric, the government subtractor for the Hanford project, which was just 30 miles from my home. They extracted radioactive plutonium to make the atomic bomb, which of course was used to wipe out Nagasaki. I applied and got a job there. It was very isolated, way out in the sagebrush. The workers would go out to the top secret fields and do something with radiation. They had little badges they wore to see if they got too much exposure. My job was to put those badges in a machine to see how much radiation they'd received. I'd been on the job for about 4 months, and I was putting badges in the machine, and my supervisor came in and said, "Jeanette, I don't know what this is about, but they want you down at AEC. That's Atomic Energy Commission. You got to go now." In order to get to the job site, you took these shuttle buses that drove about 45 minutes to an hour out to these Quonset huts. He said, "Take the shuttle bus into town and go to the office." I had no idea what this was about. I'm 18 years old. There was an outer office with a gray-haired woman's receptionist. I gave her my name and she said, "Have a seat. He'll be right with you." Shortly after, this young man, 24, 25 years old, very handsome man with coal black hair, white teeth, impeccably dressed in a blue suit, called me in and told me to sit down. He said, "Do you know why you're here?" And I told him, "No." He said, "You weren't honest with us." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "In your application." He said, "Do you know what we do here? This is top secret work. We have to be very careful with who we hire." And I'm trying to think, what do I do? He says, "On your job application, you were asked if you ever lived anywhere else for over 4 months. You have, haven't you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You went to San Francisco for 5 months and had a baby, didn't you?" And I said, "Yes." "And you didn't tell us, did you?" I said, "No." He said, "You thought you could sneak away, have a baby, come back, and lie about it on your application." He said, "Have you considered that if the communists found that out, in order for you to keep that secret, you would have to give them secrets about your job?" I was just sobbing. He convinced me that I could be coerced into giving up information so that the communists could keep my secret. I put badges in a hole and wrote down numbers. I had a security clearance, but I didn't know anything. I didn't even understand what they were doing. But by the time it made all the sense in the world to me, I thought, my God, I could have overthrown the free world. When I left through the outer office, the gray-haired woman wouldn't look at me, but she said, "He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that." I was sobbing all the way back on the bus. I knew right then that I would not be going around telling anyone about this baby. I didn't for 43 years. If I had not separated that baby from me when I was pregnant, I really had separated him then. I became a registered nurse. I got into a terrible marriage a few years later and had other children. But I never even mentioned this incident ever. I had visions, though. I had visions of a knock on the door, and it would be him. In the small town where I attended nursing school, the newspaper would list all the births in the paper. The reporters would call every night. We had 2 boards, the real births and the no information births, which would not be listed in the paper. I thought those were terrible, terrible women. They were tramps. I never connected my pregnancy with anything that had happened in my life ever. The social structure at the time was so rigid that I couldn't acknowledge it. Eisenhower was president, and we were in an ultra-conservative era. The boys had just come home from the war, and they were building houses. They were going to school on the GI Bill, and we were getting America back together again. I never really knew about that the adoption movement was opening up. Never paid any attention to it. It had nothing to do with me because I never had a child. In 1995, my kids are grown, they're out of the house, and my neighbor came over one evening. She was divorced and had 2 adult sons that she was having difficulty with. She started crying, and to make her feel less bad, I told her about my son. I thought, oh my God, I'm talking about it for the first time ever. She said, "Why don't you find him?" And I said, "I can't. What are you talking about?" And she said, "Just go find him." She came back with a phone number for the Oregon Adoption Rights Association. And I listened to their message. I'm thinking, this is crazy. But I went to their meeting. I was just sitting there with my mouth open. This woman is talking about her search. And she said she knew that her daughter was in Iowa. And she was going to see if she could find a yearbook picture. I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because I yearned for her." That was so alien to me. She said, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Because I'm curious. He might have died in Vietnam." And I'm thinking, what's this concept of yearning? When the searcher called me and said, "I found your son," I wanted to argue with her. "That's not my son. No, it's the baby." It was always that baby. It was the most remarkable thing to think of. This is my son. I called him and said, "I have something very personal to talk to you about." He said, "You're my mother," and he started crying. We talked for about 45 minutes, and he said, "It wasn't good, you know. It wasn't good. My mother started drinking right away." He said, "I'm coming to see you on Thursday." I fell in love with him instantly. That motherly way, not in a weird way. Absolutely instantly. He stayed the weekend. He was planning on leaving Monday, but he left on Sunday, and I'm glad he did. It was too much. It was more than I could bear. I didn't hear from him for 2 months, and I went into an incredible depression. Then he called and said, "Well, I need to tell you something. When I saw you, I drove as far as Roseburg, pulled over at the rest stop, and called my wife and asked for a divorce." He said it was a terrible marriage, but it was so liberating to meet you. I was able to do it. The first 2 years of our relationship were very rocky. I've never figured out why. Then one day it all came together. He asked me to come down and visit him, and he asked if he could call me Mom. We've had the best reunion. I totally fell in love with him, every part of being in love. I was obsessed for 4 years. 10 minutes didn't go by. I didn't think about him. He's a really nice guy. He was a commander with the county sheriff's department, and he left to become the chief of police in another town. He just retired. He had a terrible, terrible childhood. His adoptive mother drank herself to death when he was 14 or 15. His father traveled and left him in a charge. At 11 years old, he was buying the groceries and raising his younger siblings. I was just outraged at them. I thought adoption was wonderful. It never occurred to me that it wasn't. Why didn't they help me keep him rather than help me give him away? This is kind of unfair for my other children, but I think my life began at 60 when I found my son. For the first time ever, I was able to love someone in a way that I was not able to before. I started loving my raised children more. I could love them. The most shameful thing in my life was now sitting in front of me, talking to me. I never had to be ashamed of anything I did again. I went to my 50th high school reunion and I told them the story of having my son because I didn't ever want to hide him again. If there was anything shameful about it, it was giving my baby away to strangers, not having my baby. It was by far the biggest event in my life. It shaped my adulthood because I was a child when I had him. I couldn't get close to anyone ever. I had self-esteem issues that were just incredible. I married down. I never stood up for myself. At one point, I probably drank too much, and I could have been a better mom. I think I spent a lot of my life being unhappy. Then there was the incredible joy of finding him, and the terrible sadness of having missed all those years. But it almost felt good to get into that grief and live it. I don't know if there's such a thing as joyful grief, but that's what I would call it. I would cry and sob and scream, but so glad I was finally grieving. It's still very shameful to say you gave your baby away. One day at work, I printed something out on the printer that had something to do with birth mothers, and one of the nurses picked it up and said, "Jeanette, is there something you're not telling us?" So even though I never wanted to hide him ever again, I still do. I had my 70th birthday not too long ago, and it still colors my life. All right, guys, that is the end of Jeanette's story. As we can see that for birth moms, it is something that affects them daily. There's a lot of birth moms now speaking more out on TikTok and Facebook. Maybe a little bit on YouTube. I'm not really on YouTube in the way looking for birth mom stories, so I'll be honest with you guys. I'm more on TikTok, listening, but let's just be kind, because even though I know many of us adoptees still want to blame birth moms for a lot, they still were coerced. They didn't really have a choice. It was this or nothing, right? So, just remember that adoption affects them as much as it affects us. Anyway, guys, I will see you guys tomorrow for 5.2. Sorry, that is Ruth's story. And this will be up as well as the chapter 5 reading. All right, guys, I'll see you tomorrow.